Good day, this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you for Reason to Resist from Montreal, Canada on December 19th, 2025. Today we're pleased to be joined again by our friend John Helmer. John is the longest continuously serving foreign correspondent in Russia and the only Western journalist to direct his own bureau independent of national or commercial ties. Born and educated in Australia, then at Harvard, John has also been a professor of political science, sociology, and journalism and an advisor to governments. He's also published numerous books about some juicy political topics, his latest being Long Live Novichok, the British poison which fooled the world. Thank you again for joining us, John.
Thank you for having me, Dimitri.
So, John, today I'd like to discuss with you the interminable debates and discussions within the European Union about continuing to fund the NATO proxy war in Ukraine and whether to use frozen Russian central bank assets for that purpose. Now, before we talk about that, and hopefully we'll have time to move on to another subject, but we're going to focus on that today. I just want to remind everybody, if they find this video to be informative, please like and share it. And if you're not already a subscriber to Reason to Resist, we warmly encourage you to become one and help us reach a broader audience with our unapologetic resistance journalism. So, John, let's begin with yesterday's, if I may say, farcical events in the European Union. After tortuous and contentious debate and discussion, European leaders agreed to provide an interest-free loan to Ukraine. This is what the reports say. To meet its military and economic needs for the next 2 years. The leaders decided to borrow cash on capital markets to fund Ukraine's defense against Russia. Rather than use Russian frozen assets, the deal is to provide 90 billion euros, which is about 105.5 billion US. EU Council President Antonio Costa, who announced the deal, did not specify the source of the funding, at least not the last time I checked, but a draft text of the summit's conclusion seen by Reuters said it would come from capital markets secured against the EU budget rather than the bloc proceeding with its plan to use frozen Russian assets.
Yeah.
After the deal was struck, Hungarian leader Viktor Orbán had some choice words about the deal, which I'd like to share with you.
Okay, so there was a deal for these 90 billion to Ukraine, but Hungary is participating, is contributing or not?
No, Hungary is totally out of that. I think it's a bad decision. All the others, except the Czechs and Slovaks, think that it was a good decision. I think it was an extremely bad decision, which bring Europe closer to the war. And it looks like a loan, but of course the Ukrainians will never be able to pay it back. So it's a lost money. And those who are behind that loan will take the responsibility and the financial consequences of that. 3 countries decided not to be part of it. That's an opt-out for Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary. So we are innocent.
I don't know if I'd go so far as to say that they're innocent. Let's start with a simple, discrete question, John. And I want to explore a lot of angles on this story. But what do we know about the source of the funding? Is Orbán's characterization essentially correct?
More or less, yes. But what he's left out is the very significant split that's emerging between the little Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, and the little dictator of France, Emmanuel Macron. What we have here is something that President Putin, who's just this afternoon finished his long end-of-year direct line, Itogi Goda, the results of the year press conference, has characterized in describing Merz and Macron as podzvinki, which means little pigs. And
that doesn't sound particularly nice to the little pigs.
Well, he didn't call them filthy swine. That would be a different Russian word. In fact, podzvinki is a kind of diminutive, which is kind of endearing about little pigs, even if they're Gadarene swine and they're busy going over the Gadarene cliff, which is what the Russian side sees. Let's go back.
What I was suggesting was that President Putin had insulted little pigs, but not that he did that kind. And I just want to clarify that. But
sorry, I missed that. He certainly didn't mean to insult eaters of pork or large pigs or female pigs or pigs in general. Filthy swine's different. And what he did say, and the Russian term he used, implies that they're kind of underling pigs, meaning they're under the United States. And that was interesting too. Let's go back and take the pieces one by one. In the first place, I should mention that Putin directly responded to the failure of the EU, but in particular, it was an initiative of Merz, von der Leyen, backed by the Poles and the British and some others. What Putin said, and I'm looking down to read it, was, and he just said it this afternoon, stealing's not the right word for it. Stealing is covert theft of property, but they are doing this openly. Therefore, it's robbery. Why aren't they succeeding? Because the consequences will be grave for the robbers. What does this mean? This is Putin talking a few hours ago. First, it's difficult to accomplish. They've not said they will rob and seize. One of their ideas is to issue a reparation loan secured by our assets. He goes on, and it's really quite an interesting analysis, which was well prepared. First, what's happening is that any attempt by the Europeans to use the sovereign assets of the central bank, the 300 billion, give or take a few billion, that were confiscated, frozen in the sanctions that immediately followed the beginning of the war in February 2022. Any attempt at that will result in tit for tat. Now, tit for tat for the Russian side's already been signaled with a central bank lawsuit in Russia against Euroclear, one of the clearing agencies that holds in Belgium a large amount of these funds. Forgive me if I don't get the arithmetic exactly right. It's hard to hold all this stuff in my old head. But let's be very clear what the Financial Times, representing the money markets, said day before yesterday. Guess which country holds the most assets subject to Russian confiscation if there's a European confiscation and a Russian asset financing of the Ukraine war? It's the United States, okay? The US corporations way exceed in their liability, their vulnerability to Russian retaliation, any of the Europeans. Let me just read, looking to my side, the papers on my desk, who are the biggest holders of assets in Russia that would be confiscated in retaliation. The United States leads with about $33 billion worth of assets. That's US banks, US oil companies. They're not insignificant when it comes to talking to the US Treasury Secretary Bessent, nor the President of the United States. They're followed by Austria, then Germany, then Italy, then France, Switzerland, Hungary. UK's way down the bottom, and Poland is way, way down the bottom. So Poland can talk big.
Just for comparison purposes, could you just tell us what are the numbers, the actual numbers for Germany and France? You said it's 33 billion for the US.
I'm looking at the table that appeared in the Financial Times piece, and I'm shuffling papers. So excuse me if you're watching this for the clumsiness. It was published 2 hours ago. The headline is Putin's retaliation threat over frozen assets rattles EU capitals. Rattle isn't the right word. And the table that I'm looking at shows assets in Russia in the billions, and I have to look carefully from up and down the table. The numbers aren't exact, but roughly between 33 and 35 billion for the United States, For Austria, it's about 23 billion. For Germany, it's about 17 billion. Italy, about 15 billion. France, about 12. Now,
And what's the total, John? Do they say what the total is?
the total is, let me just look, $127 billion worth of assets in Russia as of 2024, according to a research paper by the Kiev School of Economics Institute. There is a long paper by the Kiev Institute assessing why it was a good idea to steal all this money. I've looked at that. I haven't got the table and the papers in front of me. But what's happening over this attempt to confiscate and loan into the war, as Orbán said, it's lost money. It'll never be repaid. It's actually direct war-fighting finance. On the one hand, the Ukrainians say they have to get raised to fight on in 26 and 27, $138 billion, roughly speaking. So 90 billion just confirmed in Brussels won't meet the ticket, won't pay enough. But worse, since it's war-fighting money, the Russian side has already indicated retaliation will be exact. So any amount spent on out of Russian assets will be confiscated directly. There's interest and dividends accruing to US and other foreign investors, especially banks. Austria, Italy, these are France. These are their liabilities in Russia are dominated by banks, and banks talk rather loudly in politics. So what's happening here is that there's a split within the European Union that Orbán didn't mention. On the one hand, it's Merz, who is most keen to go on fighting in the Ukraine. The US is less keen, and in the middle, there's an argument between France and Germany, between Macron and Merz, over the long-term positioning of how Europe will rearm. France and other Europeans, but particularly France, has no real interest in seeing Merz establish a German-led rearmament of Europe. That's much too like Hitler. And Macron is a little Hitler. Macron is pinching Joe Kennedy's old line, fascism is the cure for communism. That's exactly what the Germans are running, but they can't afford it. They can't afford it. On the other hand, Macron, who's as desperately unpopular politically and rules by decree against Parliament in France, doesn't want the rearmament of Europe versus Russia. The war against Russia is the argument, the justification for this rearmament. The French don't want to see Germany come out of this war as the dominant military power in Europe. All of this is very well understood in Moscow. So what Putin has just said is, I can quote him, when you attach as your collateral to a loan for war fighting in the Ukraine, your budget, your state budget, you must show as your state budget accounting an increase in your liabilities, especially a war that you're losing at the front. So what Putin is saying is, and I'm quoting, our state debt is 17.7%. In France, their state debt is 120% of their GDP. So what will happen if the budgets of these states that want to lend to a losing war out of their collateralized by their budget is their credit rating will go down. Their cost of borrowing to finance their budget deficit will go up. Their budget deficit balloons. What's that mean? It means more tax More tax means more anger, more resistance in France, in Germany, everywhere. Not only the cost of living going up, but the cost of taxation to pay for a losing war. Russia understands this perfectly. So what's happened in Brussels today is a total failure of the German fascist line. Joe Kennedy, fascism is the cure for communism. Merz is the cure for Russia. That's the line. And France, nobody who ever suffered from Germany will tolerate that from this fellow, Friedrich Merz, whose own election base is less than 28% at the last election. So what's happening here is they can't afford to go on funding the Ukraine. They really can't. They can't go to their voters to pay for it. So they tried the stunt of stealing the Russian assets. Russian retaliation then hits Germany less than it hits the United States. And Trump is very sensitive to Wall Street that can't write off this level of debt. If it does, what does it do to their profit line? What does it do to their share price? What does that do to the bonuses of the senior executives that lend money to Trump's refinancing? It's all very intimate, and money talks truth. And money here is talking truer than the propaganda in the newspapers. I hope that's a bit clearer. We can elaborate on just how different France and Germany are from the United States on this issue. And it was very, very foolish of the Europeans to promote a confrontation like this with the United States over something as sensitive as money for power. You never do that in politics unless you know you're going to win. And these chaps are not only losing on the battlefield, they're losing at home. And in this contest, let's forget the British. President Putin doesn't even mention Keir Starmer anymore. The British no longer count. The great lion is no more, not even a bulldog. It's insignificant financially and insignificant militarily in this new game.
Before we dig further into the internal stresses of the NATO alliance with respect to this issue, I just want to touch upon the whole question of whether the EU can, let's park for a moment the idea of confiscating Russian central bank assets, which appears at least to have been shelved, if not abandoned altogether. Yeah. So now they're going down this proposal to issue bonds. This sounds similar to the Eurobond proposal that was put forward back in 2009, 2012, when the EU was in a financial crisis. And back then, the idea was that if the Union found a mechanism to issue bonds backed up by the full faith and credit of all EU member states, including Germany, then the more troubled states within the Union, financially speaking, which at that point in time were primarily Greece and Italy and Spain, that they would be able to access the credit markets at lower rates of interest. And not surprisingly, those governments, the so-called fringe governments of the European Union, they supported this proposal, but it encountered strong opposition, especially from Germany. Right. And the plan never actually moved forward. And my understanding, I'm no expert in the relevant treaties of the European Union, but my understanding is there's a serious question about whether this is even legal, whether they can issue collective bonds. Do you have any insight into that, John? Is this something that is legally questionable from the perspective of EU law?
I'm afraid I don't. No, not an EU law specialist here.
Right.
I think you're making a good general point. If you risk the credit of either the entire European Union budget without the permission and consensus of all the European Union members. If you do that, or you risk the credit of the principal sources of budget funds in the European Union, Germany, France, the UK, and Italy, let's say. If you do that, you risk a level of liability that these individual countries can't tolerate any longer. And to risk it in a losing war on a battlefield that is visibly destroyed, where everybody understands in the streets of Europe what Viktor Orbán just said. The war's lost. The Ukrainians can never pay back. You're burning money, taxpayer money, French money, German money, British money on the battlefield against Russia. Then you are in the process of destroying the financial stability of the entire European Union. It's indefensible politically.
And this brings me to my next point. I mean, this all has the air of panic and disarray and
Yes.
a bunch of chickens, or in this case, we may say piglets, running around with their heads cut off. And I wonder whether this is actually going to go through. I mean, when you have people like Viktor Orbán running around saying the things that he's saying to the press, just straight up claiming, in effect, that this is a fraud, that the proponents of this proposal are perpetrating on Europeans, calling it a loan when in fact it's just an outright grant of 90 billion euros, flushing of 90 billion euros down a proxy war toilet. I would suggest that there is a real question whether politically they're going to be able to actually implement this proposal, quite apart from the legality of it. What do you think is likely to happen, John? Do you think that this is just they're just in complete and utter disarray, and that this is not realistically possible?
Well, let me try to answer this question. It's the valuable question, but let me not express it as my opinion, because I think the evidence is what the folks at home, but all of us listening and watching this, need to understand. In the first place, and I can't hold up the numbers, but if you go to Politico and you ask for the national parliament voting intention for Germany, what you see has happened is very interesting. Beginning with 28% of popular support back in June of this year, over the last 6 months, Merz has been losing public support from a relatively low level in a weak coalition. He began with 28%, roughly what he got. The CDU party, Christian Democratic Union Coalition Party, won in the last parliamentary election. But something crucial happened on September the 10th. On that day, there was a crossover. The AfD, the Alliance for Germany, crossed over and became stronger in German public opinion and in voter intention than the Prime Minister, than the Chancellor's CDU. So it crossed over. All right. That's really interesting, because votes and money here are what count. And so in Germany, what's actually happening in the election calculations, Merz thinks he's going to steal right-wing votes from the AfD, repress the AfD he's doing, crush them, stop them having access to the media, and so on and so on, frighten German independent media from publishing. That's what's happening. But the crossover is a cynical calculation by Friedrich Merz that he can steal fascist votes by appealing to the AfD's underlying, quotes, anti-communist or anti-Slav or anti-Russian or fundamentally white supremacist racist imperialism of the Hitler kind. That's why I began with calling Merz a little Hitler. Why I remind everybody that Joe Kennedy supported Adolf Hitler in the 30s when President Roosevelt was, let's say, neutral, on the basis that Germany would fight the Soviet Union. Fascism was the cure for communism. That's what Merz is calculating as a vote winner. It's not panic in a sense. It's not confusion, which is what a lot of other podcasters are saying. It's not a coalition of the brain dead. Merz is not brain dead. No, he's different. He's making a, let's call it, rational calculation. The other thing to look at, and I'm looking at papers, sorry you can't see the state of my desk, is the way money talks. Money is talking as if Germany has lost the war against Russia. I wish I could hold it up. I'd put it on the Dances with Bears after we finish talking. But if you go to the Financial Times or any share market measurement and you put in the index for the German aerospace and defense companies and you look at their share price, here's what's happened. The share price, therefore the bonuses of the executives, therefore the expansion of investment in various parts of Germany that are built on remilitarization. When you look at the German aerospace defense index, you see the takeoff at the beginning of the war in the Ukraine. The index was roughly speaking 1,000. Since then, it's jumped 6.5 times up to a peak of 6,500 in July. That's how much money in Germany wants war with Russia. Not losing war, making weapons to give to the Ukrainians to lose and be destroyed on the battlefield. Money in Germany voted for war. Money voted for Merz. But since July, the index has turned down. For the first real indication that German money is losing its nerve. From a peak of 6,500, the German Aerospace and Defense Index, shares of all the little and big companies that make weapons in Germany, has gone from 6,500 to 5,000. That's only a 15% decrease, but it's steep. And it's a reversal of the trend since the war began. What does it mean? Well, my diagnosis is that both money, as just described, and votes are moving against Merz. So he's trying very hard to say, no, folks. We've got to keep fighting Russia, because if we don't fight them in the Ukraine, we'll fight them. They'll come to us. They'll fight Germany. And you get various Merz underlings. Podvinky, as Putin's call them, little pigs, under Merz, generals and other politicians, all keep saying the same thing. Russia threatens Germany. Well, it's hogwash, to use another pig metaphor, hogwash, but it's a cynical calculation on Merz's part that rearmament will steal AfD votes and steal or recover support from the money interests, the capital interests, the investment in the future of Germany. That's what it is. Now, to misunderstand that so is a very bad mistake on the part of the United States. I mean, I'm looking, for example, at Jeffrey Sachs, who's just published what he calls an open letter to Chancellor Merz. I don't know why Sachs would do this other than publicizing Sachs himself, because you don't publish open letters to chancellors of Germany unless you mean to persuade the people who read the letter, because it's full of stuff that assumes that Merz is, for example, and I'm quoting Sachs, a duty to approach this moment with historical seriousness and honesty. That's not, does he understand? Does Sachs understand? Do podcasters understand? Germany is a political entity that makes money and vote calculations just like everywhere else. To talk to Germany, let alone Merz, about duty as if it's a moral issue is to misunderstand how politics works. He continues to, Sachs that is, appeal to Merz's better judgment, moral judgment. This is a fundamental miscalculation from the United States of how Germany is functioning and how resentful, worried, defensive everyone who's been a victim of Germany in Europe feels, including victims of Germany in Russia. And for Sachs to make an appeal to German goodwill, morality, rational assessment, this is to fundamentally misunderstand the politics of Germany. I have to assume that Jeffrey Sachs is a smart guy. Therefore, he can't be making such a political mistake. He must be appealing to somebody to finance him in Germany to run an American view of how Germany's making a mistake. That may be a financial calculation on Jeffrey Sachs's part, but Donald Trump speaks much more credibly to the Germans than Jeffrey Sachs will.
I'm glad you raised Donald Trump, John, because I wanted to ask you about the Trump administration's attitude towards all of this. So presumably, now that they have not gone down the path of asset confiscation, the EU, U.S. fears of the confiscation of U.S. corporate assets by the Russian Federation will have receded. There would be no point at this stage in the U.S. The Russian Federation retaliating against U.S. corporations in this scenario. One would think,
for the time being, yes.
But nonetheless, if this is a realistic project, this, let's call it the Eurobond offering.
Yes,
that's going to end up in another $90 billion being sunk into Ukraine, which, putting aside issues about, manpower, the manpower crisis in the Ukrainian military and the paucity of military hardware at this stage, it will keep the war going for some time, presumably.
Yes.
It will have the impact of prolonging the war, perhaps for a year or more, beyond what it would have, how long it would have gone on for had there been no further funding. So Trump, if he's really serious about bringing the war to Ukraine in an end, as he does not tire of telling us, notwithstanding that the fact that this alternative is not going to expose U.S. corporations to confiscation risk, presumably he would be expressing some opposition to the idea of sinking another $90 billion, 90 billion euros into the funding of the Ukraine war. If he really wants to bring it to an end, is there any indication that he's not on board with this idea that the Europeans are going to sink another $90 billion into the proxy war, or is he seem inclined to go along with it?
I'm not so sure I'm the right guy to ask what goes on in Donald Trump's brain. But
I'd never ask you that. That would be unfair.
So better to ask what goes on in his back pocket, because he's made it very clear, as has Jared Kushner. He doesn't say much, but he represents, along with Stephen Witkoff, Howard Lutnick, and the others, a very clear understanding of what the interest in this war is from the American back pocket point of view, meaning their wallet. I think it would be correct to say that Trump has said, this isn't my war, and I'm not going to lose it. First. Second, that's an inaccuracy. We don't have to get into that. Second, I'm not only not going to lose it, but if you guys, the Europeans, want to go on fighting, you will buy from me what the wherewithal that you will fight with will require. So I'm for NATO expanding to 5%. You buy the stuff, the military material from me. I grow rich. If you grow dumb, that's your problem. I grow rich. And he's explained that in his customary, simple way. Slogans, mottos, jingles, his repetitive remarks. He is selling Europe the wherewithal to go on fighting if that's what they want to do. He, Trump, claims he's not. He claims we must all avoid a defeat. We must therefore negotiate. And if the Europeans want to fiddle with the terms of the negotiation, Trump's calculation is that it's win-win for him, isn't it? The longer the war goes on, the more destruction the Russian side inflicts on everything Europe has put up in its path. Now, President Putin has just finished today's afternoon briefing in which he's basically said, and I'm looking down at exactly what he said. He said, once he talked about the capture, the end of the resistance in Pokrovsk, Krasnoarmeysk, its Russian name, and he talks about particular operations surrounding Ukrainian force resistance with pockets that are surrounded of more than 3,000 men. Then he says, and I'm quoting him, their position is practically hopeless as they are tightly surrounded by our armed forces. Once that operation is concluded, and it will be, our units will then redirect westward. I'm confident, absolutely confident, says Putin, that before the year's end, we will see further significant successes by our armed forces all along the line of contact. So what Putin is saying is, the longer this goes on, the more we will clean out the pockets. We will liquidate the remaining Ukrainian resistance inside those pockets. And we will save the civilians whom the Ukrainian army are killing rather than allow them to surrender or simply wait for the Russian army to arrive. What will then happen is the Russian forces will move further and further westward across the Dnieper River, westward towards Kiev. So from a combination of Russian and American points of view, Trump wins if the Europeans want to go on fighting and go on losing. The Russian side equally says, it's a strange negotiation here. The Europeans want to continue to risk. We will negotiate with Trump, as we are, but we will make no compromises, neither on territory, nor on foreign troops, nor on military alliances. We will make no compromises. This is very, very clear now on the part of the Russian side. President Putin, and in the negotiations which are largely now avoided the Russian Foreign Ministry and the American State Department. So the negotiations can slow down. Trump has removed all the peace by Christmas negotiated agreements before Christmas. He's removed the deadlines in order to let the Europeans learn that the cost of losing, cost of delaying and losing grows bigger and bigger every day. So from my point of view, from the point of view of the Russian sources I've talked about this point in the last few hours, one, Trump has stopped trying to convince the Europeans he's ready to, not going to say it, let Putin destroy them if necessary. And if that happens, he will fund he will allow the Europeans to finance the US wherewithal, but he won't act in such a way, as he's threatened in the past to act, beyond what he's done to threaten Russia on the battlefield and in the economic warfare sanctions area. So what we have is a very perverse situation the Europeans can't publicly discuss. They're losing at home, they're losing abroad. They calculate they must go on winning, but can't. And Trump sits back and says, let Putin, expletive deleted, do it to the Ukrainians and Europeans. I benefit. And Putin says, if the Europeans want to interfere with the terms we're discussing with the Americans, as they appear to be doing, let them. If there's no negotiation, we'll take the territories by force. That seems to be the situation as my Russian sources see it. It seems to be the situation as the Trump side describes it. And leaving out the expletives, leaving out the incredible, mistaken, misleading European press, it's the problem for Merz and Macron now.
Mm-hmm. So lastly, on this point of yesterday's developments and today's press conference, other than the highlights that you've already discussed from President Putin's end-of-year address today, is there anything else that you took away from it that was particularly notable, whether or not it's related to the Ukraine war?
Well, there are several things, and we don't really have time to go into them. But I'd like to make one point, because the Europeans and the Americans supporting continuation of the war seem to believe Russia's economy is on its last legs. Russia is desperate to reach an agreement. So this is a complete fabrication of an exhibition of democracy at work in Russia, which is more than one can say for either the United States right now or the Europeans. This issue is the Russian central bank key rate. Okay, this is the core of this problem inside Russia. Domestically, the central bank governed by Elvira Nabiullina has been running a so-called anti-inflation policy with a key interest rate over 20%. It was 21%. And as Putin was talking, and because he was talking, Nabiullina's central bank announced they were cutting the key rate from 16.5 by 50 basis points to 16%. So Putin was able to announce in part of the Q&A that the central bank has just cut the key interest rate down to 16%. Then Putin says, according to the law, the Bank of Russia is an independent institution, so I try not to interfere with its decisions and to shield it from any outside influence or pressure. That's nonsense. And everyone in Russia knows it. There is a very serious, active debate, and there has been for months now, that the central bank rate protected by the president was too high to sustain in domestic investment. As domestic investment fell, the pressure to lower the key interest rate has grown. And what we see here is the responsiveness of the president to domestic political and economic constituencies saying, either you lower the key rate or we face recession next year and the year after. And I've talked about it on this program before. The central bank has in fact forecast recession unless the key rate comes down, unless domestic investment other than military investment is revived. That's a key issue inside Russia. It's not, however, no way, it is not the sign of a collapsing an economy. It's the sign of reviving democracy and Russian money speaking at the president, so that he's had to respond to increasing pressure to revive investment and revive growth, because Nabiullina's policy's been crushing growth. Okay, so when the president says he doesn't interfere with Nabiullina, everybody in Russia has another drink. The outcome is different. The outcome is that the Russian economy now stands a better chance of domestic revival. But the key rate has to come down from 16% to less than 12% to be really effective. Now, there are two elements to this. It's true that the key rate is 16%, but there are all sorts of preferential central bank interest rates. Preferential interest rate policy is a form of, let's say, discretionary economic direction. So the government can, in fact, make it a whole lot easier for designated industries and companies to get cheaper money if they reinvest. Since no Russian oligarch can these days take central bank money out of the country, steal it, and invest it in France or Britain or some other place, as the oligarchs have done before. Since that's impossible in a war situation, the central bank's key rate can be reduced by discretion, by government decision. That preferential system, however, is potentially corrupt. You can buy a preferential rate. I'm not in a position to analyze, because no one is in a position to analyze exactly how the preferential rate system works. What we are able to say, what macroeconomists in Russia continue to say in the parliament, in the press, is that unless the key rate comes really down for everybody, we won't have revival. And that's what Putin has just signaled he accepts as a doctrine, as a policy guidance. So I see what he's just said as a very positive indicator that the Kremlin will not tolerate recession next year, and is taking the measures necessary to prevent that. That's not a sign of a collapsing economy. That's the sign of a confident economy on revival.
Now, if the Russian central bank is significantly lowering interest rates, I mean, in general, when the central bank lowers interest rates, the currency, the domestic currency, tends to fall vis-a-vis other major currencies.
Yes.
And interestingly, the US dollar has fallen precipitously against the Russian ruble this year. It was fetching almost 114 rubles on January 1st. And as of today, it's at 80.7. So it's a huge drop. Right.
Yes.
So I'm curious, I don't know whether you're in a position to comment on this, but this reduction in the central bank's interest rates in the Russian Federation will presumably have some impact on the exchange rate for the ruble. Now,
right.
I just mentioned the fact that the U.S. dollar has fallen precipitously against the ruble because I thought it was interesting, but I imagine that's not really having a major impact either way on the Russian economy because of the sanctions. There's basically been no business. There's virtually no business between the United States and Russia. In terms of trade. So I can't imagine whatever happens with the U.S. dollar ruble exchange rate that's going to be a major factor for the Russian economy. But what about Russia's the exchange rate vis-a-vis other currencies that do matter to the Russian Federation? For example, the yuan or the rupee in India. Is there a danger that the lowering of these interest rates, although they will help to avoid a recession, will have negative impacts on trade for the Russian Federation or positive impacts? How do you see that playing out?
That's beyond my competence. I would hesitate to make clear predictions about Indian trade or China trade or non-US dollar denominated trade. All I can say is that that clearly, because of the US sanctions war, the European sanctions war, larger and larger percentages of Russian trade and commodity exchange and payment systems are outside the dollar zone now. whether or not the price of oil is fixed in dollars, the discount against that price caused by sanctions, or by the latest sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil exports to India and other countries. The role of the dollar gets less and less in those bilateral and multilateral trading arrangements. Second, and we've talked about on this program before, the problem of India-Russia rupee-ruble payment systems has been a very serious obstacle to a significant enhancement of India-Russia trade and India-Russia investment. And since Putin was in Delhi, the commitment on the Russian side to begin investing in India and using up the rupee surpluses that have been built up, not losing them to intermediation through Dubai into dollars, but reinvesting Russian-earned rupees in India. That was a crucial part of long-term Indian-Russian partnership strategy. As for the China-Russia relationship outside the dollar, I'm not prepared. I simply haven't prepped and I haven't swatted the data to give you a good answer.
Yeah, I just will point out also, I appreciate that, John. I hadn't given you a heads up that I planned to raise this, nor was I planning to raise this, but I think it is interesting to note that it's not just the US dollar that's fallen precipitously. The yuan has fallen from 15.6 rubles per yuan at the end of last year, December 31st, to 11.44 rubles per yuan. Again, a huge decrease. That's the exchange rate today. And in the case of India's rupee, it's fallen from, it looks like 1.29 rubles per rupee at December 31st, down to 0.89 rubles per rupee. So all three of these major currencies have seen a precipitous decline vis-a-vis the ruble. I'm wondering if that's because, in large part, because the central bank of Russia, aggressively increased interest rates during the past year. Is that in fact something that happened during the past year, that it aggressively increased interest rates? Because perhaps that's an explanation.
I don't know. Best I say I don't know. But the increase of central bank interest rates to the peak of 21% happened before this year. It's been a steady increase, and this year has seen slight decreases under enormous pressure from the business community, from the State Duma, to bring the rate down from 21%. It's now 16%. That's a 25% reduction, but it's nowhere near, and I can only quote you what the Russian papers are already saying today, and you can see them translated into Reuters already over the last few hours. 16% isn't enough to revive Russian trade. Pardon me. Bilateral trade for Russia in rubles, exports, for example, of coal, exports of steel, all of these things have been affected negatively by dropping demand in the rest of the world, but in particular, reduction of construction activity in China means less steel. It means less production of steel. It means less consumption of metallurgical coal and coke and so forth. These global macroeconomic reductions in demand are to a large degree independent of the war in the Ukraine. And that's putting immense pressure on Russian export earners and in different parts of the country. This is not however, not an economy in collapse. When we talk about economies in collapse, we talk France, we talk Germany, we talk the UK. We don't talk Russia. Russia's got problems, and it's solving those problems with effective, stable political consensus, and it's fighting a war against the rest of the world at the same time. So that's about the limit of where I can currently talk about ruble rates, trading relations, and so forth. I can't go beyond my competence, and I shan't.
I appreciate that. So thank you for your integrity and honesty, and maybe we'll find a way to have a more fulsome and informative discussion about these exchange rates, because this is really quite something. I myself wasn't aware before we began talking today that all of these three major currencies had fallen so sharply against the ruble. Certainly doesn't seem consistent with the narrative that Russia's economy is collapsing. But in any case, John, always a great pleasure to talk to you, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Thanks for our meeting, Dimitri. I look forward to. Thank you.
And we're signing off today for Reason to Resist.